Alrighty, in this video we're going to put together all the infrastructure required to set up our push notifications. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to first hop into my manifest because there's a couple of changes we got to make here. We're going to need to request some permissions, but what's interesting is we're actually going to have to make our own permission. Now, you can define in Android your own permissions, and what's cool about it is these permissions can be requested and queried by applications, custom applications, for example, and they can also control how your other applications can access your application's data. So we're going to create our own permission that'll basically disallow any other application from accessing our GCM service, which is required in order to use the GCM service to begin with. So to define your own permission, you not surprisingly open up a permission element inside of your Android manifest. And note that I'm doing this underneath the root manifest. Now the name of what I'm about to write is important. The first permission is we're going to request permission to receive messages from GCM. So that's going to be com.google.android.c2dm.permission.receive. So make sure that's all spelled correctly, and it is we want uses permission on that. So we want to go ahead and use that permission, and then we want to create our own permission, and our own permission is going to be called com.buzz.yora permission C2D message. Now this is important. Before I explain that, let's go ahead and specify that the protection level is going to be signature. The protection level signature is that what I was talking about a second ago, where this will disallow other applications that aren't part of our same package from accessing this permission. Now, this permission we're asking from Google, this permission we're creating, and the permission is significant right here. That has to be your package name. It has to correspond to the package that we have up here in the manifest's root elements attribute. And then the rest of it also has to line up permission.c2d message. So now now that we've defined that permission, let's specify that we use that permission. I know it seems kind of silly that we define a permission, then we have to request it ourselves, but that's just how it works. So basically, I'm going to just take this whole thing that we just made right here, and I'm going to copy and paste it. Just take that, copy that, and paste that there. So now we're creating a permission and we're requesting it ourselves. Alrighty, the next thing we're going to do is going to be a little bit long, but is unfortunately pretty much required. Now, a lot of this code is explained in the documentation, so I'm not going to worry too much about it, and it's also a lot of stuff that we've already done, but it's necessary in order to register ourselves. So remember how we have the API endpoint called register GCM? That's because each application on each device gets a unique ID that allows my server to send that particular device a particular message. We need to register ourselves with the Google Play services and then send the registration ID that we receive from that to my server so that it can send out the push notifications. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to jump down to my build.gradle module app, and I'm going to go ahead and add a new element here because we do need to grab something from Gradle. And the thing that we're going to grab is going to be, I'm going to go down here and start a new line. I'm going to say compile com google android.gms play-services 730. So I'm going to grab this new package, and this will allow us to use the Play services within our app. So now I'm going to say sync now. So again, not only do you need to have the Play services installed on your device, you also need to grab the package itself and add it as a dependency in order for your code to actually make use of it. So we'll let that run, and I'll explain what we're about to write. We're about to write a fragment. And the fragment isn't going to be something that's going to be physically displayed. It's not going to have a UI. Instead, what it's going to do is it's going to register itself with GCM. And then in our authenticate activity and our login activity, what we're going to do is we're going to invoke that fragment and have it sit there and do its thing so that we make sure that we're always registered with GCM. So let's come down here to our fragments package, and I'm going to right-click fragments, select new Java class, and I'm going to do GCM or register GCM fragment. Let's go ahead and fix that naming real fast. It's a little bad. Fragment. And then I'm just going to go from top to bottom, I guess. We'll start off with our tag. because we're going to do some logging here. So I'm going to do private final static string tag. I'm going to make this equal to the name of the fragment. And before I forget, I should probably make sure that my fragment inherits from base fragment. Then I'm going to do a private final string, or private final static int play services unavailable. This will be a status code to say that we can't access play services on this device. Then we'll have a static int play services showing dialog. Now this happens when the play services aren't installed but could be installed. Now I want to point out that the play services can install themselves but not on Genymotion VMs, which is why we had to do that process manually. But on somebody else's phone, physical device, that doesn't have the play services installed, they can actually show a dialog to tell the user to install them. Then I'm going to do a private final static int play services available and set that to 2. Then I'm going to do a private static final int play services resolution request. I'm going to set this to 9,000, I guess. That's what was in the documentation. I guess they decided that was a number that didn't conflict with anything. Then I'm going to do a private final static string property registration ID, which will be equal to registration ID. Private final static string property app version, which will be set to app version. And private static final string sender ID. Now sender ID is going to be set to a very specific number. 1089345595. 1089345595. 1367. That happens to be my sender ID. So by registering with this sender ID, it authenticates the device to receive push notifications from this sender. Anyway, so make sure you get that number correct. All right, so now I'm going to do a public static register GCM fragment method. It's going to be called get, and it's going to take in a GCM registration callback, which is an interface we haven't created yet, and I'm going to call it callback. A boolean is new user, and a fragment manager. Now for the fragment manager, I'm going to be using the non-support fragment manager, so make sure you import that correctly. Then I'm going to say register GCM fragment equals cast2 register GCM fragment. Then I'm going to say fragment manager dot find fragment by tag. Then if fragment does not equal null, return fragment. So this basically says go ahead and see if the fragment already exists. If it does, then just return it. Otherwise, create a new one. So I'm going to say fragment equals new register GCM fragment. And I'm going to say fragment.current callback equals callback. And fragment.isNewUser equals isNewUser. And then fragment manager dot begin transaction dot add fragment tag commit. And then I'm simply going to return fragment. So this will just add the fragment to the fragment manager. Now I know these fields don't exist yet. They will here in a second. So let's knock out our fields real fast. We're going to do a private Google Cloud messaging, which is the object that's going to be responsible for handling the registration. I'm going to call this cloud messaging. And then we'll do private GCM registration callback, or current callback, which is that field that interface we haven't created yet. Private shared preferences, and then private context, application context, and private boolean is new user. Now I'm going to go ahead and create an onCreate. So I'm going to do alt insert override members onCreate. And for our onCreate, the first thing I'll do is call this super. After that, we'll grab our application context. So I'm going to say application context. Well, in this case, we do actually have our application from our base fragment. So I am going to actually nuke that field. Because we can actually, I just realized, wait a sec, we're inheriting from base fragment, which has access to the application object. We don't need to alias that out to anything. Then I'm going to say cloud messaging equals Google Cloud Messaging dot get instance, and I'm going to pass in the application context, or the application in this case. Then I'm going to say preferences equals, shared preferences equals application.getSharedPreferences, passing in registered or register GCM fragment dot class dot get simple name for our personal preferences, and then I'm going to pass in context mode private. So just like what we did with our auth token, we're going to be saving some information, persisting it into our shared preferences. Next up, I'm going to say status equals check play status, which is a function we haven't made yet. And I'll say if status equals play services available, then that means we're ready to go. We have the play services installed, everything's good. So then I'm going to say string registration ID equals get registration ID, passing in my application. Well, I don't even need to pass an application context in this case. Then I'm going to say if registration ID is empty, then do registration. Otherwise, if we're a new user, then bus.post new account update GCM registration request, passing in our registration ID. Otherwise, callback, so our current callback dot GCM finished. And then finally, all the way here, I'm going to do an else if on the status. And I'm going to say else if status equals play services unavailable. Then I'm going to say current callback dot GCM finished. So what I'm doing here really is we're first going to make sure that the Google Play services are installed. If they are, we're going to try to get our registration ID that's going to be persisted in our shared preferences. But if for any reason we need to request a new registration ID, this will return an empty string, which is why we do that check right there. And if it is an empty string, we do our registration. Otherwise, we check to see if we're a new user. If we're a new user, we have to send our registration ID to the servers so that it updates the push notification service to know that this user is now associated with this registration ID and not someone else. Anyway, if we're not a new user and we have a registration ID, then we'll tell our callback that our GCM is finished and we'll just exit. If the Google Play services are completely unavailable and just not able to be installed, we'll also say GCM finished, indicating that we're not going to process any further, and push notifications simply won't be enabled on this device. All right, let's start off with our check play status. Our check play status is I'm going to say int result equals Google Play services util dot is Google Play services available, passing in get activity for the context. And if result equals connection result dot success, that means Google Play services are installed and working. So I can simply return play services available. Otherwise, if not, Google Play services util dot is user recoverable error result. So if it's not possible for the user to recover from this, like you can't display that dialog for some reason, then I'm going to return play services unavailable, indicating that, well, we're kind of done. We have nothing else that we can do at this point, so just go ahead and call GCM finished. Otherwise, I'm going to do a dialog. So I'm going to say dialog play dialog equals Google Play services util dot get error dialog, and I'm going to pass in my result, my activity, and play services resolution request. Then I'm simply going to say play dialog dot set on cancel listener equals new on cancel listener, and that'll simply say current callback dot GCM finished. So if they cancel out of that resolution dialog, just exit this whole process. Then simply say play dialog dot show and return play services showing dialog. All right, so now let's go ahead and do my, let's see here, our on activity result. So I'm going to come down here to the bottom and I'm going to create a new overriding member, on activity result. What I'm going to do here is simply if the result code, or if the request code equals play service resolution request, then I'm going to do current callback.gcm finished. So if they were to resolve that issue, then we'll just exit out there. Next up, let's go ahead and do my get registration ID. So see how this method's used? This method's used, and it'll return an empty string if the registration ID needs to be reset or doesn't exist. So I'm going to do a private string get registration ID. And for this, let's start off with trying to get it from my shared preferences. So I'm going to say registration ID equals shared preferences dot get string property registration ID with an empty string default. If registration ID is null or registration ID is empty, then simply return empty string. Otherwise, I'm going to say registered version equals preferences, shared preferences, dot get int property app version with the default of integer min value. Then I'm going to say then I'm going to get my current version. So int current version equals get app version, which is a method we haven't made yet. Then I'm going to say if my registered version does not equal my current version, then return empty string. Then finally, if you get past all those checks, return registration ID. So what am I doing here? Well, I'm trying to extract my registration ID from my shared preferences. If I don't have one, or if I do have one, what I do is I get my current app version, and then I get the version of the app that was registered with GCM. And then if they don't match, I go ahead and I return empty string. If they do match, I'm considered to be all ready and my registration ID is valid. So now let's do our get app version. Private static int get app version, or sorry, private int get app version. I'm simply going to do try return application.get package manager .get package info. And I'm going to pass in context.get package name, or sorry, application.get package name, and 0.version code. And we'll do a catch on exception E, and then I'll throw a new, I'll throw a new runtime exception because this is a bug with the code. Could not get package name E. So that'll get our current app version. All right, so next up, we should work on our do registration method. So our do registration method is simply responsible for registering this application with the Google services. So I'm going to say private void do registration. And for this, I'm going to do a new async task. And it's going to be a void string. And then I'm going to open that up. And at the end of this, I'm going to do .execute. And then up here, I'm going to put my keyboard cursor on the squigglies, hit Alt, Enter, Enter, Enter to implement do in background. And for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say try return cloud messaging .register sender ID. And we'll catch a exception E, and I'll say log.e tag could not register, passing in E. Make sure we go ahead and get that log imported. And then if that happens, I'm going to return an empty, or return null. Then I'm going to go ahead and put my keyboard cursor inside of this anonymous inner class, hit Alt Insert, do another overriding member of onPostExecute. And for onPostExecute, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say update GCM registration S, which is a method we haven't written yet, but we'll go ahead and do that right now. So now I'm going to say private void update GCM registration string registration ID. And this is going to actually go and save the registration ID and the app version inside of our shared preferences. So I'm going to say shared preferences dot editor equals shared preferences dot edit. And then I'm going to say editor.put string property registration ID, and then do registration ID. So we'll save that. We'll also put the string property app version with get app version. And then we're going to go ahead and say editor.apply. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if registration ID does not equal null. Oh, whoops. This should be a put int, not a put string for our version. If registration ID does not equal null, then I want to go ahead and say bus.post new account update GCM registration request registration ID. If it is null, I just want to do current callback.gcm finished. The last thing I got to do, or before I finish my interface, of course, is to create to subscribe to public void GCM registration updated of type account GCM response, and I'm going to say if not response.did succeed, then I want to say response show error toast get activity for the context. And then I want to go ahead and I want to clear out my registration ID. I don't want it anymore if it failed to update on the site. So I'm going to say shared preferences editor equals preferences edit, or shared preferences edit. And I'm going to say editor.putString property registration ID empty string, and I'll say editor.apply. Finally, I'll go ahead and invoke my callback. So I'll say current callback.gcm finished. Now the last thing I want to do here is I want to create my private or my public interface for my callback. And that interface name is GCM registration callback. And it only has one method on it, as you've seen, void GCM finished. That's it. So I'll go ahead and scroll up through this class, or how about starting at the top and scroll down. But otherwise, basically all we have left here for our GCM infrastructure is to go ahead and actually invoke this fragment anytime that we log in or authenticate with our authentication token. So that's going to be in two places, in our login activity and in our authenticate activity. So let's go ahead and do that. That's going to be pretty straightforward here. I'm going to start off with my authenticate activity. So I'm going to jump up here to my authentication activity. I'm going to have him implement GCM registration callback.gcm registration callback, or register GCM fragment.gcm registration callback. Hit Alt Enter to get my GCM finished down there. But before I do that, basically what I want to do is on my on login with local token, I want to take this code right here, all of this code, and I want to replace it. So I'm going to cut it. So I'm going to hit Control X to cut that. I'm going to say register GCM fragment get this false get fragment manager. Then I'm going to take that code I just cut and I'm going to paste it inside of GCM finished. So I'm just adding a new level of indirection here, where we go ahead and we add the fragment does its thing, updates the GCM registration, and then when we're finished, then we do what we used to have done. Now let's go ahead and do our login activity. So coming in the login activity, going all the way down to our on activity result, which is kind of the funnel from which everywhere all our registration and logging in works. Instead of immediately calling finish login, I'm going to say GCM registration fragment dot get. I'm going to pass in a new GCM registration callback for that. Now before I write GCM finished, I'm going to go ahead and do isNewUser is going to be request code equals request register. So if they just registered, then isNewUser will be set to true, which will replace whatever old GCM registration used to be set up on that device. Then for the fragment manager, I'll simply say get fragment manager. Now for the innards of this, I'm just going to say not finish, but finish login. There's two separate methods and you don't want to get them confused. All right. Well, that's probably pretty much all we need to do there. So let's go ahead and hit play and see what happens. Now, we're not going to really see anything here. Instead, what's going to happen is we're just mostly going to make sure that it doesn't error out. I can also take a look at the database to make sure that our GCM registrations are actually making their way all the way up to the API. But I'll verify that for you guys after these devices start up. All right, so we can go ahead and see that. I don't care about security problems on these devices. So it looks like we're still having problems in KitKat, but let's go ahead and see on our Lollipop if maybe it's just going to take a couple seconds for it to spool up the IIS website. Okay, so sweet. We did get a dialog here. This app won't run unless you update Google Play services. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's hit update, and let's hit update. So as you see, the error dialog actually worked, which is pretty cool there. Now, I'll go ahead and check the database to see if I got a GCM registration, and I did. So Lollipop is now, the Lollipop device is now registered with GCM. Still crashing a little bit, but that's okay. So now let's hop back to the application here, and let's see if we get another GCM registration. Might want to restart the app here. I think because I'm using this on this emulator or on this VM that's not supposed to have this sort of stuff on it, it's having problems. And we got a second GCM registration for him. So now KitKat and Lollipop are registered. So basically now, really all that's left is to create what's called a broadcast receiver, which is going to receive all of our awesome push notifications. And at that point, push notifications will be finished. So I think we're going to do that in the next video, and we'll see you guys then.